Welcome everyone to Thursday's edition of our Rosemont College Writers and Readers series here at the Rosemont Writers Retreat. I'm very happy to welcome back Elise Juska, who has been with us off and on since the wee beginning back in 2008. So I'm so happy that you were able to come back this year. Elise, let me just read you her bio. Elise Juska's novel and stories The Blessings was selected for Barnes & Noble's Discover Great New Writers series, Entertainment Weekly's Must List, and the Philadelphia Inquirer's Best Book of 2014. Her new novel, If We Had Known, was released in April 2018, so it's brand new. Juska's short fiction has appeared in Plowshares, the Gettysburg Review, the Missouri Review, the Hudson Review, the Colorado Review, and Prairie Schooner, and numerous other publications. She's the recipient of the Alice Hoffman Prize for Fiction from Plowshares, and her short fiction has been cited by the Best American Short Stories and Pushcart Prize anthologies. She teaches fiction writing at the University of the Arts, where she received the 2014 Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching. So please welcome Elise Juska. I wanted to actually, because I know your very first novel came out in 2003, and that was sort of like before the bust. And now you've published some novels like through the bust and after the bust. And when I talk about the bust in the publishing industry, I'm talking about sort of that period between 2008 and 2012, where things were very rocky. Nobody was really publishing a lot, and the economy, during the downturn in the economy, one of the things that people think about is like when the economy gets really bad and gas prices go up, it affects the price of a lot of things like paper. So paper got to be very expensive, which then affected the publishing industry. It's all these different sort of things. So how do you think things have changed in the industry since what kind of changes have you noticed since 2003?
I think the bust actually coincided with a period where I was sort of between books. I, fortunately, I guess, didn't have something that I was trying to sell really during that time. I published my first 3 books in pretty quick succession, and I published them with Simon & Schuster, and I had kind of a difficult relationship with the imprint I was on. It didn't feel like a great fit. My editor and I were maybe not a great fit just aesthetically. So once my contract was up with Simon & Schuster, I sort of took a breath and just backed off and was just sort of writing on my own without a contract, which was just what I needed at that time, which was about that time. Blessings then I sold in I think 2012, so that was maybe the tail end of that period, and then of course this one came out this year. I mean, the biggest thing that I've noticed is more from the sort of publicity marketing end, which is that there is so much more pressure to be on social media, to be promoting yourself on social media. I am terrible with social media, and that just feels uncomfortable. But I think that's one of the biggest differences. I also noticed just in terms of like post-publication touring and things, there are fewer. I used to do many, many more readings and events, and the trend seems to be away from doing that. I don't think publishers see that as so much as something that sells books. They see other things as selling books. And, again, most of it is very like internet-centric. I didn't really have to contend with that gap in the middle in terms of trying to sell something, but I do really notice those kinds of differences in terms of like what happens when the book comes out.
Right. And you switched agents at that time too, or I think, as I recall, or
right. So my contract was up with Simon & Schuster, and I decided to leave the agent that I had been with. She and I actually really loved her as a person, but I thought she was just not that aggressive, and it was hard. It was like a breakup, where I had to tell her I wanted to move on to someone else. But yeah, so I found myself in this moment of like no contract, no agent. It was, for me, great.
Yeah.
I just wasn't worried about a deadline. I was just writing really joyfully in a way that I hadn't for a little while. And in that period, I wrote The Blessings, and I found my new agent, who was wonderful. But good memory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was sort of a complete break at that point, and then I've come back around, and I'm now with a different publisher, editor, agent, shebang.
Great.
Yeah.
So, I know you also, like around that time, you got married, and now have a, a little boy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you also are running the BFA program until shortly, right?
Yes.
At University of the Arts. You were the first director of that BFA program.
Right.
So I haven't really I haven't talked to anybody about this too much, but so how do you balance all these things? I mean, I think that's something a lot of people think about. It's like, well, I have a job and a family, and I really want to write. And you've written and published 2 books in this time, plus done all these other things. So maybe you can share some of your strategies for getting it done.
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, I guess one thing is, if I could, I would get up every day at 4:30 a.m. and I would write till dinner time. I would just go as long as I could every single day, and I used to think I needed that I needed to be that kind of writer. Now, of course, with my son, I just have to write differently, and it turns out I can, so
Right.
I can do something with 2 hours. I can do something with 1 hour. I can do more with less, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm an early riser anyway, so I get up early, and every day, no matter what, if I'm teaching, whatever I'm doing, I just sort of protect that time in the morning. I read, I write, I just sort of like tap into that part of myself. I have the summers off, which helps a lot. My husband has the summers off. He's a school counselor, so he's on duty a lot during the summer. That's just sort of fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But it is really hard. I mean, I think I'm somebody. I know not all teachers feel this way, but for me, the teaching really fuels the writing.
Mm-hmm.
I get excited talking about fiction in the classroom, and I bring that back to my own work. It doesn't drain me. It kind of like just boosts me up. So that helps. But yeah, it's really, really hard to balance it all. And this book in particular, I know we'll get into this, but it's just about a difficult topic, and writing that difficult topic with a newborn, the sort of emotional rawness of having a new baby and trying to write a book about what this book is about is a real challenge.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about that because I know, like I said, we see each other sporadically, but we've touched base, and I know that and we talked about it a little bit last night, that you had written another book kind of on the same topic before you wrote The Blessings.
Right.
And I thought, oh, well, she got The Blessings published, and then I thought this was that book, and you said, no, it was different. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, this book has been a strange 11-year journey. So I got the idea for this book, you probably remember this, after the Virginia Tech shooting, which was 2007. There was an interview with the shooter's creative writing teacher. Her name is Lucinda Roy, and she talked about how she had seen in his creative writing assignments this really violent, alarming material. And in fact, she was working with him one-on-one because the teacher whose class he was in, actually Nikki Giovanni, had asked to be removed from that class because he was upsetting the other students. I was so haunted by that interview. She had tried to get the counseling center to intervene, the police, the administration, because she just knew so clearly from reading the creative writing that something was wrong. So I at that time was teaching creative writing. I had never had anything cross my desk that was so, unambiguously alarming or so violent, but I definitely had seen student work that worried me, in different ways. And I know that can be a hard thing as a writing teacher to evaluate. Is this something I need to act on? Is this fiction? Is this so based in reality that someone needs to intervene? And Virginia Tech, I think it was unambiguous that someone had to do something, should have done something, but I think often that's not the case. Those are hard, complicated calls to make. So I just thought a lot about that interview and imagined a story where a writing teacher realizes after a shooting that the gunman had been her student, and then discovers a paper that he had written for her class that indicated maybe that he was violent that she didn't act on. So that was the idea that I had. I wrote a short story about that was later published in Prairie Schooner. But I also wrote a novel which took that sort of premise, but it was the story of a writing teacher who had a student who wrote a paper that was troubling, but it was that the student was a female student, she was depressed and she was suicidal. It was just a sort of different version of that story. I wrote that novel, I got my agent off of that novel, and then we sent it to a few editors who like almost took it but had some reservations about it, and I just started to feel like it wasn't quite working. I just shelved it. I chalked it up to sort of figuring out what that book was meant to be, and then after the blessings I wrote this book, which totally different characters but a similar premise, just taken. I think the mistake was I just didn't take it far enough.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's sort of like what I tell my students sometimes: take some small true thing and just push it to the nth degree, just exaggerate it, make it bigger, make it more dramatic, make the stakes higher. I think I just hadn't gone far enough with it. So, yeah, this was a story I guess I wasn't much looking forward to just dwelling inside of for 4 years, but that's what needed to happen. And so that was it was a long trip to get to this. It was an unseasonably hot, late summer day in Maine when Maggie's daughter read about the shooting. The kind of hot you could sense just by looking, the sky that flat, empty blue. Along the back of Maggie's yard, the trees stood motionless and silent, thick green spruces and pale, thin-stemmed birches. The heat was like a haze, a filter through which the world appeared grayer, more obscure, like fog on glass. It was just before noon of Friday. In a little over a week, Maggie would be back to teaching, her life built around her classes and crowded with her students. But these final days of August were still long and shapeless, defined by the immediacy of Anna's leaving. Maggie looked up from where she knelt in her garden, pushed a lock of hair off her damp brow, and surveyed her property, a shaggy 2 acres strewn with rocks and wildflowers, an old red barn, woods on 3 sides. Later, looking back, the stillness of the trees that day would seem different, tense, knowing, braced for something, but in the moment they appeared only sleepy in the heat. Maggie tore a final handful of weeds from the garden, pushed herself to standing, closed and latched the fence gate, and headed for the back door. Inside, she let the screen flap shut behind her. The house was quiet. Anna was upstairs packing. Maggie spied a few things: down comforter, windbreaker, old scuffed leather boots in a pile by the front door. She had just turned on the faucet and was rinsing dirt from her hands when Anna shouted, "Mom?" "Yes," Maggie called back over the rush of water. "Mom." Even from a floor below, Maggie could hear the telltale edge in her voice. "What?" she said, twisting the faucet off, and paused, leaning on the knob. "Did you ever have Nathan Dugan?" Right away, Maggie recognized the name. She prided herself on her memory of her students, would argue she could summon up any one of them given 10 seconds, and with this one, she didn't miss a beat. "He was in my comp," Maggie said. She straightened and stood still, waiting, hands dripping over the sink. She heard movement in Anna's bedroom, footsteps hurrying down the hall. "Why? So you knew him?" Anna said, louder as she ran downstairs. "Of course," Maggie replied, calmly, but she felt a kernel of worry. "He was my student." She pressed her wet palms to her jeans. "What is it, Anna?" she said as her daughter rushed into the room. She was still wearing the clothes she had slept in, old t-shirt, plaid pajama bottoms, hair tied in a loose ponytail, but her expression was awake, alarmed. This was more than nerves, Maggie thought. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading, cheeks pale beneath her summer freckles. She carried her laptop under her arm. As she set it on the table, she kept her eyes on Maggie's face. Fatal shooting spree in Reed, Maine Mall. At least 3 dead. Suspected gunman, student at Central Maine State. "Oh my God," Maggie said. She could hear the stillness in her voice. She was conscious of the body's instinct to freeze, flatten, and protect itself. "Oh my God," she repeated. It had happened again, happened here, just 15 minutes down the road. As Anna scrolled down the screen, Maggie took in a photo of 2 teenagers standing outside the mall, hugging. A mother clutching her baby, her face such a raw mask of pain that Maggie felt indignant it had been put online. And suddenly, Nathan Dugan. "Alleged gunman takes own life," the caption read. The picture was just his face. It was him, no question, though he looked considerably older than the number of years, 4, 5, it had been since he was in her class. He was bigger now, heavier. His face seemed thicker. The buzz cut he'd worn as a freshman had grown past his ears. He had 2 faint lines of mustache, a cap with some kind of cartoon animal on it. His chin was raised, eyes angled down toward the camera, although his expression looked preoccupied, as if residing in his own private world. It was the thing she remembered most about him. He'd worn that same look in class. "Is that him?" Anna asked. She had folded herself into a kitchen chair, arms wrapped around her knees. "That's him." "Was he creepy?" "Creepy," Maggie repeated. "I wouldn't say that." Usually this would have prompted a roll of the eyes. Maggie was a stickler for language, always looking for the best, the most accurate word, but her daughter had fallen quiet, reverent, before the faint glow of the screen. What was he like? He was different. A simplistic word and an obvious one. Her mind roamed, looking for a better way, the right way, to describe him. He wasn't too engaged, she said. Other details were returning. The way, during class, Nathan always kept his eyes on the desktop, jiggling one shoe, heavy brown boots with thick ridged soles on the dusty tiles, the pair of headphones he'd kept around his neck, and the minute class was over, clamped back on his ears. He sometimes brought his dog to class, a chocolate lab, who slept with its flank pressed against the radiator. To Maggie's recollection, Nathan never acknowledged the dog, and she didn't either. He didn't seem to care much about being there, she said. He was restless. Restless how? Anna asked. Like anxious? No, I don't think so, Maggie said, with a glance at her daughter's face. More like, she paused, distracted, checked out. She remembered how, if he spoke, which was rare, Nathan never raised his hand. He called her Mrs. Daly, even though she always told students to call her Maggie. She remembered his essays, too, not the content so much as the look of them, long, unbroken paragraphs and small, stifled font. He wasn't really a part of things, she said, part of the group. She thought again. He was hard to get to know. Creepy, you mean? She remembered his coat, a heavy olive green parka with a hood trimmed in dirty, peppery gray fur. In winter, he'd never take it off. The coat would fill the small desk, the hood blocking Maggie's view of the students behind him and giving the permanent impression that class was about to end. With another student, she would have said, "Relax and stay a while," but with Nathan, she was certain she'd said nothing. His response would have been too literal, too humorless, and the coat surely would have stayed on, in so doing, growing only more visible to the rest of them. Was he a good student, Anna said, her eyes still on the laptop? In a way. He was diligent, as I recall. Did he have friends? Not that I knew of. She studied Nathan Dugan's face. His cheeks looked rougher, acne-scarred maybe, though it was hard to tell on the screen. But I wouldn't have known that necessarily. Did you like him? Maggie did not think of her students in those terms, made a point of it, like parents with their children, but in fact, no, she hadn't liked him. I don't think of my students that way, she said. From the living room, Anna's cell phone started ringing, the aftermath beginning. Outside, remarkably enough, the world looked as it had just moments before. The sky seemed muted, absent of everything, wind, colors, clouds. Against all that emptiness, the old red barn stood proud, near pristine, etched starkly against the pale afternoon. So that's the first scene. And then the barn is where it turns out she's been sort of saving her students' papers over the years, and it's where she eventually goes out and discovers this paper that alarms her when she looks back on it, and then sets the rest of the story in motion.